Our hallmark is the reintroduction of the Scimitar-horned Oryx, which is the most dramatic of the 4 species of oryx in Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. It is a beautiful, beautiful beast. And it's a global tragedy that it was allowed to go extinct in the first place.
Welcome to another episode of Rewilding the World with me, Ben Goldsmith. Today I'm going to be speaking to a legendary conservationist, John Watkin, the outgoing chief executive of Sahara Conservation. John and his team have been charged with restoring a truly immense landscape in Africa's northern Sahel region, even reintroducing species that had either disappeared or nearly disappeared, the addax, scimitar-horned oryx, various species of gazelles. It's a truly extraordinary story of very challenging work in one of the most difficult parts of Africa. John, thanks so much for taking the time to be with me today.
You're welcome, Ben. It's very nice to be together finally to talk properly about conservation.
John, just starting with you, you grew up in Zambia.
Yeah, my parents were very adventurous, and my father moved out to Zambia as a telecommunications engineer for the police, and my mum was a teacher locally. So they moved out with the first 2 kids, and then my younger brother and I were born in Zambia.
And were you always a passionate nature lover, and did you always know you were going to work in restoration?
It was pretty much hardwired from the age of 7, as far as I can remember. But yes, my first dream was to be an Olympic athlete, win the high jump gold medal, and sell that gold medal for a vast amount of money and create an area for nature.
That's fantastic. It's like the philanthropist Sir Christopher Hone, on whose foundation I sit as a trustee, once said to me, showed me a photograph of some children on a rubbish dump that he saw during his travels off to university. And he said, Ben, I didn't think to myself, if I get rich, I'll help those children. I thought to myself, I'm going to get rich in order to help those children. And of course he did. And his foundation is now one of the biggest nature and humanitarian foundations in Europe. So you knew from a very early age, like Sir Christopher Hone, that you wanted to devote yourself to these things. How did you get into conservation? Where did you start?
So we moved from Zambia when I was 9 years old to the New Hebrides in the Pacific. And then in 1980, came to UK. And then it was a pretty desperate, difficult path. But I was pretty committed to the idea of working as a field conservationist. And fortunately, I've discovered a place called the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust in Slimbridge in Gloucestershire. And thanks to some incredibly important people and great mentors at the Wildfowl Wetlands Trust, I found that there was a career in conservation in wildlife biology. And that really did turn me around. So once I completed my degree, I went on to do a master's at Durham University, but was very, very fortunate to study flamingos in the Camargue at the Tordevala Research Centre in the south of France. And that again was another huge turning point in my life. It gave me a very different perspective on conservation globally.
So John, when did you then get involved in the Sahel? How did you come across that region?
I had known of the formation of the Sahara Conservation Fund back in 2004 when it was first created. I had just moved from working in Kenya, Tanzania, and Congo to the States. Actually, I'd had a plane crash in Garamba National Park in 2003. And as I walked away from the plane crash, I was convinced I had to find a proper job and stop risking a lot to try and further my career. So I moved to Washington, D.C. to work for the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund, which is a donor program supported by 7 major donors. And I was with them for 10 years. But during that time, I'd met Steve Montfort, who was the former founding president of the association. And he had worked with John Newby for many years on trying to promote the conservation of the Sahara and the Sahel. And John Newby had been a lone voice for many, many decades at this point, promoting the importance of the Sahara and the Sahel region and trying to keep it conscious in people's minds when it was really a conservation orphan.
Okay, can you paint a picture for me of what the Sahel might have been like before the advent of motorized vehicles, guns, and large numbers of domestic grazing animals? I mean, how was this landscape in prehistory?
So, I find it difficult when people call it a desert because it's not deserted. There is an awful lot of biodiversity. There's an awful lot of nature there. A lot of it's very specialized and highly adapted to the extreme conditions. And then you've got very seasonal rainfall, very low but very seasonal rainfall. So at points in time, you can have you would have had vast plains of beautiful grasses with, quite low densities, but vast numbers of desert antelopes throughout the entire Sahel and Sahara region. Each species was adapted to a different niche within that whole environment. And this straddled the entire region, which comprises 16 countries in Africa. The Sahara is the size of continental US or China. So it's a vast realm. It also, provides us with a huge number of ecosystem services in terms of generating wind from the heat of the sun causing the thermals off the sand. And there are dusts that are picked up from Paleo Lake Chad and deposited on the Amazon forest that fertilize the forest. So we're all tied to the Sahara in one way or another, and we always have been.
When we talk about the area that your organization, Sahara Conservation Fund, is focused on, are we talking about the Sahara Desert itself, the interior of the desert, as well as the Sahel, or are you principally focused on that shore around the periphery of the desert?
So the majority of our operations are in Chad and Niger. And in Chad, we actually are working with the government of Chad on the management of a reserve called the Wadi Rime Wadi Ashim Fauna Reserve. It's the size of Scotland, so it is a vast area. If Chad was a donut, the center, the whole would be the size of the reserve. It's the fourth largest country in Africa. So, these are very huge areas. And that reserve straddles the isocline between the Sahel, the grassy shore, and the Sahara Desert in the interior.
And what are the principal herbivorous species that would have been found there and that you're working on restoring?
So our hallmark is the reintroduction of the Scimitar-horned Oryx, which is the most dramatic of the 4 species of oryx in Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. It is a beautiful, beautiful beast, and it's a global tragedy that it was allowed to go extinct in the first place.
So you say that the Scimitar-horned Oryx fell extinct. Where were the last remaining individuals?
So anecdotally, I think it was in Chad. And I think when John Newby was based in Chad as a United Nations volunteer in 1971 onwards, and then he moved to Niger, he did have reports of addax and Scimitar-horned Oryx from both Chad and Niger on the border region between the two countries.
And some individuals of the Scimitar-horned Oryx remained in captivity in Abu Dhabi, right?
So I think the Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed had fallen in love with the Scimitar-horned Oryx and asked whether he could have some for his private collection. And I think that coincided with some of the other wildlife entrepreneurs trying to also take some from different populations and provide them to zoos around the world. They're a beautiful animal, but also they can't jump very, very high. So they make really good exhibits because you don't have to fence to 3 or 4 meters high as you have to do with eland and other species. So, there was a population in captivity, taken into captivity, which was as an ark, it was really the source population for the reintroduction program. But the problem was they were taken from just one population, I think. I don't know the specific details, but because of the genetic diversity in the individuals that were found being very narrow, we realized that they were taken from probably only one population, possibly in Chad.
And Abu Dhabi itself subsequently went on to sponsor the return of captive-born Scimitar-horned Oryx to Chad in the last few years. How did that come about and how has it gone?
So the Environment Agency Abu Dhabi should be credited fully with their activities in conserving not just the Scimitar-horned Oryx, but also the Arabian Oryx and many, many other species that they have piloted and pioneered the reintroduction of. And they have been extraordinary in terms of their support to all of the activities, both in Abu Dhabi with the breeding centres and also facilitating the reintroduction programs. John Newby, when he left Wildlife WWF, he went to work for the Environment Agency Abu Dhabi for a period. And it was there that he was able to work with the Environment Agency Abu Dhabi to hatch the plan to try and release the Scimitar-horned Oryx back to the wild. And that involved a series of steps that happened many, many years before the first releases that took place in 2016. But the success of the reintroduction program cannot be denied. Since 2016, we have released 263 individuals into the wild. And since that time, they have bred up to over 600 as of March this year. In terms of return on investment, if you want to talk in financial trading terms, it's an incredible return on investment. If they'd been monetized, we'd be very, very wealthy. But unfortunately, it doesn't work that way.
And the narrow genetic base of that surviving population turns out not to have been an issue through careful management in captivity and so on.
Absolutely. We work very closely with the authorities in Chad, but also with the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland and Edinburgh University on testing all of the genetics to make sure that they've got as broad a foundation of genes as possible, which allows them to withstand a disease outbreak or an extreme year of extreme drought or extreme wet.
So the restoration of the Scimitar-horned Oryx, this extraordinary grazing antelope in the Sahel and the Sahara, after having become completely extinct in the wild, is sort of a poster child for captive breeding and reintroduction. I mean, this really does work. If the will is there, it happens. And in this case, it was the Environment Agency of Abu Dhabi that did it in partnership with the Chad government. And now you say there's sort of 600 or 700 of these extraordinary animals now roaming free in Chad. How many could there be? I mean, to what extent can this species reclaim its entire former range?
Well, that's a very big question. For the reintroduction project into the Wadi Rum and Wadi Hashim Faunal Reserve to be considered a success, we need to get to a minimum of 3,500 animals and above to have a core breeding population of 500. So we are a long way from that threshold of sustained population.
Only a fifth of the animals are considered core breeding population?
So you've got the age structure, you've got animals which are reproductively redundant, you've got juvenile. So we estimate that you have to get to about 3,500. There's a book that came out recently by Millie Kerr called Wilder, and she describes very elegantly the threshold for success for this project. But that's just looking at this one population in Wadi Rum and Wadi Hashim. There's discussions about trying to expand the reintroduction and reinforcement projects to Enedi Reserve in Chad, but also talking with the government of Niger about reintroducing Scimitar-horned Oryx to the Gadabeji Biosphere Reserve. These are all prime locations for Scimitar-horned Oryx, and it would actually then help in making sure that we've got more than eggs in one basket.
This episode of Rewilding the World is very kindly brought to you by Uni, that's UNI, the world's first nature-friendly line of luxury body care. We've all heard about the harm that sun cream does to coral reefs, but it's not just sun cream and it's not just coral reefs. Well, Uni makes plastic-free, nature-friendly essentials like shampoo, conditioner, hand wash, and even natural deodorant, all full of nourishing ingredients such as seaweed kelp, aloe vera, and olive oil. We've been loving our Uni products, but don't take it from me. Here's my wife, Jemima.
Yes, I really love them. They're such clean and nourishing products. The microalgae body oil is so good and really smells amazing.
You can find Uni products at Space NK or at weareuni.com. The same species exist around the full periphery of the Sahara Desert. It's not a different species on the northern part as compared with the southern part. They move around.
No. So Marwell Zoo have done incredible work in reintroducing Scimitar-horned Oryx to Tunisia, into the southern part of Tunisia. And there've been other attempts at reintroducing addax into Morocco and again in Tunisia. So there's some precedent there for trying to bring all these populations back by doing isolated reintroduction projects that hopefully will allow the populations to increase and eventually spread throughout the former range.
And the Scimitar-horned Oryx and the addax were the two large antelopes that were most prevalent in the Sahel. Tell us about the addax. Did that go extinct in the wild?
No, but there are less than 50 thought to remain in the Termit Tintuma National Reserve in northern Niger. So when we talk about a species being critically endangered, you're talking about the last few remaining individuals. In fact, I really get frustrated with conservationists talking about vulnerable, endangered, critically endangered, because that doesn't resonate with the general population at large. And actually, Australians have a much better approach, which is buggered, and you can guess the other categories, and the final one is done. So I think we should actually, as the French, they vulgarize the terms to make it resonate more with the general public. But yeah.
I love that. So what is the strategy for saving the addax? Because the Scimitar-horned Oryx seems to be on the way to restoration. Is a similar strategy there? Captive breeding, reintroduction?
So because some individuals exist in the wild state, it would be a reinforcement project. And IUCN define these two terms very strictly about reintroduction, which is reintroducing species to where it used to be. And reinforcement is adding individuals to an already wild living population. So we adhere to those terms very clearly. One of the terms we don't use often is rewild, which has become very sexy of late, but actually when you translate it into other languages, it doesn't come across particularly well. So we're very committed to the reintroduction of Scimitar-horned Oryx and the reinforcement of addax populations.
A core recommendation of the IUCN in respect of species reintroductions and reinforcements is that the original threat to those species are removed before you start putting them back. Presumably the principal threats were hunting with guns and overgrazing by domestic livestock. Now, how are those two problems tackled in these national parks today?
We strive for coexistence. Actually, the fate of the Scimitar-horned Oryx is more related to civil conflict in the areas. And during any period of war, all wild meat is considered protein for troops and for people. And that's the world over. There are no limits on that. So that was the ultimate demise, was just the amount of pressure on them. And I think also once they got to below a certain density, they didn't interact with each other, so there wasn't enough breeding. They needed to be at a certain critical number for them to maintain their populations. There's a time lag between when a species goes biologically extinct and actually then is declared extinct in the wild. So we think the Scimitar-horned Oryx was no longer existing in the wild in 1980, but it wasn't declared extinct until 2000. So there is this time lag between events happening and then the species going extinct, which we have to bear in mind because that's an important period to say, look, it's now beyond a threshold where we can't do anything but reinforce or reintroduce.
So poaching is not the major issue today. Pretty hard to police poaching in these vast remote areas that you're talking about.
There's a lot of folklore and a lot of great respect for Scimitar-horned Oryx and addax by the local pastoralists and the local people, because a lot of the elders remember Oryx and addax from when they existed, when they were children, and they saw them around. And also there was a sort of equal transhumance between the Oryx, the addax, and people moving with the rains and the grazing pastures growing. So culturally, there's this huge stake in conserving the Scimitar-horned Oryx and the addax. And that's been a huge benefit to us. So poaching is not the most immediate threat. Things that have happened is a vast increase in the numbers of livestock. And that is not from pastoralists per se who wander through the traditional migratory routes following the grazing, but that's more from commercial grazers. So very wealthy individuals with a vast head of livestock having people go into the reserve with several thousand head of camels, goats, donkeys, sheep, and grazing them to get fat to sell in the commercial centres.
And how do you tackle that issue, especially if it's powerful individuals that own all those animals?
Trying to emphasise the need for coexistence and the cultural heritage. I was thrilled when I was last in Chad that the new 5,000 Central African franc note has elephant, Scimitar-horned Oryx and addax printed on it. It's a very beautiful, beautiful thing to see.
That's amazing. What about wild equines, John? Did you have a wild ass, for example, or any other kind of wild horses that existed in the Sahel previously?
Not in this region. The African wild ass occurs in the east, more towards Somalia and eastern Ethiopia. So that's not a species that we are focusing on at the moment.
And the smaller grazers that we'd see if we visited would be the gazelles. What kinds of gazelles and what sort of population state are they in today?
So our indicator species is the Dorcas gazelle, which is a beautiful, speedy little gazelle. And we did an aerial count in late 2021, and we estimated that we have a population of about 44,000 Dorcas gazelles in the reserve. Their presence in that area of the reserve, as I said, is our indicator that it's a healthy environment for both wildlife and people.
But just in that reserve, how many Dorcas gazelles would there be around the entirety of the Sahel and Sahara region?
There are pockets of populations here, there, and everywhere, but I think the greatest population is in Wadi Rum, Wadi Shim. But more importantly than the Dorcas gazelle, which is doing well, is the Dama gazelle. And there are less than 100 individuals of the Dama gazelle in 2 or 3 small populations between Chad and Niger. And this is the most elegant, most beautiful gazelle you will see. It's got a very long neck. It switches between being a browser in the dry season and being a grazer in the wet season. It's incredibly fragile, but extremely elegant. And one of the things that Sahara Conservation has done since January 2020 was initiate a program of captive breeding in Wadi Rim and Wadi Hashim with a number of individuals, which now we've got up to 22. And then by the end of this year, we want to start a reinforcement program of the wild population. Wadi Rim and Wadi Hashim has about 50 wild living Dama gazelles in the reserve. And it's been static at 50 for a very long time. So we'd like to know why they're not recruiting when the Dorcas gazelle is doing so well.
And do these grazing animals, the big ones and the small ones, do they venture out into the dunes and into the real heart of the Sahara? Or do they typically stay on the kind of grasslands of the Sahel regions?
We have satellite collars on many of the individuals and we're able to track their movements. And we are analysing those data to see whether they are starting to resume any of the traditional seasonal movements. And as yet, we haven't seen too much of that direct relationship to the moving north of the rains and coming back south in the dry season. We hope that will start to happen as they become more and more adapted. But these are animals that, the first generation, the individuals released had no cognizance of living in the wild and the dangers that persisted from fires from people. We have recently published a paper which looked at whether they sought to avoid the presence of people and pastoralists, which is very much the case. They do not want to associate with people. What we have done recently is also prepared a management plan for the protected area. And within that, we've stated that there are 3 core areas that should be for strict conservation. They should be areas left for native biodiversity and for the reintroduced species. So that involves a considerable level of behavior change by the pastoralists to raise awareness of the importance, talk about coexistence, and then have people starting to apply law enforcement down the line to say, look, this is an area now that's been stipulated as a core area, and you're welcome to go through it, but you can't stay in here for any duration. You can have maybe 2 nights, 48 hours, and then you have to move on. But everybody's competing for the same resource, which is grass, and that the quality and the abundance of grass is determined by the rainfall. And that is, ultimately the source of conflict between wildlife and people.
John, what about the predator species from this region? I mean, we read in the books of the existence of lions right up to the Mediterranean shore of Tunisia and Morocco. I've seen a photograph taken by a French airman in the 1920s of what's suggested to have been the last Atlas lion in Morocco. Lions, leopards, cheetahs, wild dogs, wolves. What species may have existed in the Sahel region, and what are you doing to bring them back?
So dealing with predators was one of the few things that the pastoralists said when this project was first discussed. And they were like, please do not bring any predators back. There are a number of small carnivores within the reserves. Again, a lot of them are nocturnal to try and mitigate the extreme heat. But no, there were reports of cheetahs, leopards, perhaps lion. But again, these areas are very, very seasonal in terms of rainfall with very little rain. So anything that establishes a territory will struggle during the times that there is no prey in that area because you can't just move your territory. So we are not actively working on predators. We are mindful of their existence and we make sure that our monitoring teams are looking for any signs. For me, it would be fantastic if we actually saw a desert cheetah come back to the area. Again, a great indicator would be when the first Scimitar-horned Oryx is predated by a cheetah or a lion.
But where would a cheetah come back from? I mean, does North Africa have any cheetahs left?
We assume so. There's a lot of incidental evidence that they're still present. Again, very low densities, very cryptic, not trying to draw attention to themselves, but trying to just survive in the landscape. Despite the conditions, it is still, a very important area for pastoralists. So there's a lot of people around. There are also new threats coming from gold miners and oil exploration. So, things have changed and the countries have changed. So we have to be mindful of how we work within that shifting landscape.
But cheetahs, of course, tend to do well in the absence of larger predators. So the places where cheetahs often thrive are at what appear to be the ecological margins, but they're actually places where there are fewer or no lions, hyenas, leopards, and more powerful predators, which means cheetahs can have a free run at prey and also have plenty of time to eat their prey in peace. So if any predator were to make a return to the reserve in which you're working or to the wider Sahel region, the cheetah would probably be the most likely candidate.
There's evidence that there are some cheetahs being seen around, but actually nothing confirmed. So we're always optimistic. If they were going to come from anywhere, they'd probably come from the mountains between Chad and Sudan on the east, where they could probably survive and not be too disturbed, and then come down through the wadis, which flow east to west into the reserve.
John, you're working in one of the most troubled parts of the world. And you've got the rise of Islamist insurgency and Boko Haram to your west, and the Al-Shabaab to your east. The French military have recently given up trying to quell Islamist violence in Chad and neighboring countries. How much of a hindrance is that for your work, and how difficult does that make it for wildlife to survive in this region?
Ben, that's a very targeted question. We are mindful of security. And actually, when I first started with Sahara conservation, I developed a hierarchy of security, health, family, friends, work. And if the top four are not all in a good state, then let's leave the work to try and sort itself out. So we have to be mindful of the reality of working in these situations. We have had some security issues ourselves. We have also developed security protocols to try and mitigate or limit any risk to our team members overall. We have an incredible team, both in Chad and Niger, of some of the most inspirational colleagues I've ever had the joy to work with, who we are all dedicated to the cause and the mission of the organization. But within that, we have to acknowledge where we are and what we're doing. So we try to take no risks whenever we can. And there are things that can happen. I want to have a T-shirt printed which says, "For anticiper les imprévus," which means you have to anticipate the unexpected, because that's what we work on. You never know what could happen at one day to the next in terms of vehicles breaking down, having a difficult situation with some people wanting to have assistance. We have to be as flexible and respectful of the local culture and the local administration. We work as a guest in those countries. And I think if we always go in with that approach, then we should always be welcome.
John, you told me last time we spoke that you decided to rename the organisation Sahara Conservation and to drop the word fund because you never have any money. What I'd like to know is what would you do as an organisation if you did have oodles of money? If you suddenly had the kind of money enjoyed by philharmonic orchestras and art galleries and other kind of objects of philanthropic attention, what's to be done by an organisation like yours if you were properly funded?
So we've already identified a number of key sites where we'd like to promote the conservation of those sites, which are important for all biodiversity, especially plants. And plants and especially trees are often overlooked in the conservation agenda because everybody likes the cute and fuzzies. So I would like to have a huge campaign of protected area management, improved management, training local people, trying to engage disenfranchised youth in the environment and being stakeholders in their own future. There's this program called the Great Green Wall, which I think is a good idea. And I think trying to get people re-engaged, especially youth, in being stewards for their own landscape and trying to, look after their environment and their habitat rather than it being the government's.
So geographically, if you were better funded as an organisation, you'd be working across a dozen or so countries across the entire Sahara and Sahel region.
That would be the dream.
Well, let's make it happen, John. I think you're an absolute inspiration for doing the work you do in the region that you do it. It's a place of such extraordinary romance. And whilst it's a landscape that didn't necessarily have the huge abundance and kind of density of wildlife that you find in the East African grasslands, the wildlife that you do find in the region is just so beautiful and mysterious and on its last legs and saved really because of the work of Sahara conservation. If we want to visit you, how, where, or is that just too difficult for ordinary people like me?
No, it's complicated and it's expensive, but no, it is possible. What people would like to do is come for the actual arrival of the Addax and Oryx from Abu Dhabi and then see the release into the quarantine enclosures. That's one of the most extraordinary experiences you could ever have. So, we can do that on very small numbers. We're not a tourist operation, but we do have a number of groups visit us throughout the year, dedicated photographic safaris. And we have other people who are on the circuit that includes Zakuma and Enedi National Parks and Cultural Reserve. And then they come to us in the middle just for a night or two. The desert it has its own charm, its own beauty. You do have to experience it at night to get the full experience of what it's like to be there, because it's only at night when you can go out and see honey badgers and aardvarks and all the stuff that you wouldn't see during the day.
What a joy to spend that time chatting to John Watkin. I just can't get my head around the scale of some of these landscapes in which John and his team have been working. John is now off to pursue a new career, a new life in Florida. We wish him all the best. Thank you, John, for taking the time. If you've enjoyed this podcast episode talking about the Sahel with John Watkin, I'd be really grateful if you'd spread the word among your friends, go onto whatever platform you use and leave us a review, like the podcast series and so on. It matters a lot to us. Thank you. Next time I'm going to be talking to my friend Pedro Prata of Rewilding Portugal. And Portugal is a surprisingly degraded place. A lot of the land has been converted to intensive agriculture or intensive monoculture forestry. And yet, in the huge Greater Coa Valley where Pedro lives and works, something magical and extraordinary is happening. I do hope you'll join me in my conversation with Pedro Prata next time.
You already know that this isn't about one species. It's about systems, interdependence, collapse. And yet, wild salmon, one of the clearest indicators we have, are vanishing fast. Their decline signals something deeper, something more dangerous. I'm Jim Murray. I host The Last Salmon. It's not a side story. It's the biodiversity story that everyone like you should be listening to. Season 2's out now.
One of the best ways to support rewilding is to go and visit rewilding projects on the ground. My friends at the European Nature Trust have asked me to tell you about a series of coexistence adventures that they've put together. They're designed to give you the best chance of seeing Europe's most iconic species: bears, wolves, lynx, and so on. All of these are on the rise in Europe because of rewilding projects. These trips are hosted by expert guides and conservationists, and most importantly, the European Nature Trust is giving half of the revenues directly to the foundations working on the ground to restore wildlife. I'd love you to check out these coexistence adventures at the European Nature Trust website.